before we turn it over
Yes,
to
please,
Albert?
go for it.
Okay, so good evening, dear friends. What a joy to be in community with friends literally from all over the world. This evening in our Baha'i Fireside, we're going to hear the perspective from Dr. Lopez. In the Baha'i faith, it's about personal investigation of truth, and that we all come with our own understanding and seeking, what our individual truths are. And so we also ask that during the fireside that we be mindful and not put in the chat box any of our own thoughts or questions until after Dr. Lopez speaks, just out of respect and also to be fully present. So we really do appreciate your thoughtfulness in honoring that request. Once Dr. Lopez is done speaking, we'll open it up for comments and questions. So you might want to write it down to help you remember. All right, so with that, Dr. B, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, welcome everybody. Really, it is pleasure to have our speaker. There are certain people that we really cherish very much. Dr. Lopez is one of them. And without much ado, I tell you the program for tonight. Albors is going to open with opening prayer. Then Corey is going to read 2 passages from Baha'u'llah, right? Tablets of Baha'u'llah. And then Ray is going to introduce our speaker. After that, Dr. Lopez is going to enlighten us with his thoughts. And then Dara is going to open up the chat box, and we will be anxious to hear your comments, questions, etc. Without much ado, Albers, are you ready?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. My God, whom I worship and adore, I bear witness unto thy unity and thy oneness, and acknowledge thy gifts both in the past and in the present. Thou art the all-bountiful, the overflowing showers of whose mercy have rained down upon high and low alike, and the splendors of whose grace have been shed over both the obedient and the rebellious. O God of mercy, before whose door the quintessence of mercy hath bowed down, and round the sanctuary of whose cause loving kindness in its inmost spirit has circled. We beseech thee, entreating thine ancient grace, and seeking thy present favor, that thou mayest have mercy upon all who are the manifestations of the world of being, and deny them not the outpourings of grace in thy days. All are but poor and needy, and thou, verily, art the all-possessing, the all-subduing, the all-powerful.
Corey?
Hello?
Yes, you're in.
When the day star of wisdom rose above the horizon of God's holy dispensation, it voiced this all-glorious utterance. They that are possessed of wealth and invested with authority and power must show the profoundest regard for religion. In truth, religion is a radiant light and an impregnable stronghold for the protection and welfare of the peoples of the world. For fear of God impelleth man to hold fast to that which is good, and shun all evil. Should the lamp of religion be obscured, chaos and confusion will ensue, and the lights of fairness and justice, of tranquility and peace, cease to shine. Unto this will bear witness every man of true understanding. Please God, the peoples of the world may be led, as a result of the high endeavors exerted by their rulers and the wise and learned amongst men, to recognize their best interests. How long will humanity persist in its waywardness? How long will injustice continue? How long is chaos and confusion to reign amongst men? How long will discord agitate the face of society?
It's true. Wow. Ray?
Okay, so When I was asked to introduce Dr. Lopez this evening, as someone who speaks on a fairly regular basis, there are definitely people that I'd rather be introducing than speaking after, and I think Dr. Lopez is one of those people. To let you know a little bit more about his background, he's an international economist with over 30 years of experience in international organizations, and that's including most recently at the World Bank. And these are just some of his accomplishments. He was a senior fellow at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He was the director of the World Bank Global Indicators Group, chief economist and director of the Global Competitiveness Program at the World Economic Forum in Geneva, where he was also the editor of the Global Competitiveness Report. Before joining the forum, he worked for several years in the financial sector in London, with a special focus on emerging markets, and he was the International Monetary Fund's resident representative in the Russian Federation during the 1990s. He was a professor at the University of Chile in Santiago, and he has degrees both from Cambridge University and a PhD from Purdue. So someone who's definitely well qualified to be speaking to us tonight. On a personal note, it's always a pleasure to hear Dr. Lopez speak, and again, just someone who brings a ton of knowledge to every fireside he speaks at. And I'm excited to hear his message titled 100 Years After the League of Nations and the Tablet to the Hogs.
So, Dr. Lopez, I do not believe that he is on yet. Dr. B?
Okay. Corey, could you elaborate about those two passages that you read for a minute until I get hold of Dr. Lopez?
I only read half of his resume. I'd be happy to read the other.
No, you don't need that.
Essentially what he's saying is that for some people, and I will be adding in bits and pieces from around and beyond this text for context. Essentially, he's saying that although many people, or maybe some people, are motivated to be good,
we are waiting for you.
by natural instinct and natural inclination, they're just naturally good. Many people are not, and they can go one way or the other. And there are also those who really need more than that to not be bad, to be good. The fear of God is what he's talking about. If people, now fear, of course, in this context is respect. You know, it's a fear of disappointing God more than it is a fear of being punishment. Just like you would fear to disappoint your parents by getting a bad grade or something along those lines. When all else fails, that's the last line of defense to make sure that people stay moral. And he specifically addresses the rich, of course, because if the rich decide to be immoral, the consequences of that will be much higher than if some random person with no resources decides to be immoral. So in a sense, you know, the people with wealth and people with authority, he also mentions that. So politicians, I'm sure we can all think of an example of politicians who would do well to shun evil, and maybe their countries would benefit as a result. And then, you know, and then he says, if religion is obscured, and then the only possible consequence is chaos, because religion is that last line of defense to keep people from descending into being bad. And that's what we see now, obviously. I mean, we see just consumerist, nihilistic culture that's completely out of control at every level, you know, from the rich all the way on down. There's just a complete chaos and disharmony. And he's sort of pleading with us at the end. He's just saying, how long will you keep on doing this? because he's basically saying that the power to put an end to that chaos is in our hands at all times. All we have to do is remember God and respect God. And we can always turn back and put things back under control that way.
Thank you for your thoughtfulness, Corey.
Thank you. Dara, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, very good. Dr. Lopez should be in any minute.
Wonderful.
He said in 2 minutes. Sorry for this delay. I'm sure there is a good reason for it. He's going to tell us.
Yeah, thank you everybody for your patience. May I read a virtues card? Until Dr. Lopez comes on? Yes, yes? All right.
Yes.
All right, thank you, friends. Here we go. Let's see, what virtue will be helpful? I'm gonna go random. Fairness. Fairness is treating each other even-handedly so that each person receives a share. With fairness, we meet everyone's needs. We listen to the views of others with openness and expect to be heard with equal respect. We don't focus on who is right, but on what is right for all concerned. Without bias, favoritism, or prejudice, we level the playing field. We are as protective of the rights of others as we are of our own. We seek not to overpower, but to empower. We are lovers of justice. Hear one side and you will be in the dark. Hear both sides and all will be clear. Thomas Chandler Halliburton. And the practice of fairness. Take your own inventory as I read these points. I treat others justly. I hear others' points of view with openness. I expect respect for my perspective. I care more about doing right than being right. I believe in fair play. I have a win-win attitude. I am thankful for the gift of fairness. It is our common ground. And Dr. Lopez, are you on? Okay. Does anybody want to share how fairness speaks to you?
Albers, do you feel well now? Albers disappear?
Is Dr. Lopez the 202 number that joined us? It looked like it. No? Okay, please forgive me.
Yeah, no, thank you, Pat. That's thoughtful.
He told me in 2 minutes he will be here. There's something going on.
Although maybe, so Dr. Lopez, if you are here, so there is the 202 number lighting up. Dr. Pete, it's the 202-537-26.
Just coming in now. There he is.
That's Dr. Lopez. Yes, yes.
My apologies to everybody.
No worries. Welcome, Dr. Lopez. Good evening. Do you have time to catch your breath?
Hi, how are you?
Hello, hello. Do you have time? Did you have time to catch your breath before you start speaking this evening?
Nearly 90%. We expect that to continue into this November. That's a lot. Okay, so can I just ask you a question? What's the biggest challenge you faced with that?
All right. I'm ready whenever you are.
We are ready. We are primed and ready. We know your background and where you live. No, just kidding. We're here to hear what's on your mind and heart. We turn it over to you, Dr. Lopez.
Okay.
Can you hear us, Dr. Lopez?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay.
Go for it.
Would I get
Go for
started?
it, Dr. Lopez. Yes, it's your turn. Go ahead.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. You know that 2020 is a special year on many fronts. It's actually the 100th anniversary of a vote that was taken in the US Senate, which considered what was then called the Covenant of the League of Nations. It was an international treaty that had been negotiated by President Wilson. It was an initiative that he started in an attempt to prevent something like World War I from ever happening again. I will come to that story in a few minutes. But President Wilson eventually took this international treaty to the US Senate because in the US Constitution, the US Senate is the body that endorses or rejects international treaties. And the Senate rejected the proposals put before them. And the United States did not join the League of Nations. And that happened exactly 100 years ago in 1920. But 2020 also happens to be the 100th anniversary of a tablet which the head of the Baha'i community at that time, Abdul Baha, sent to a committee of experts in support of the League. He actually sent the tablet in 1919, 101 years ago, but because of the war, they didn't get it until the following year. And Abdul Baha actually sent a delegation to deliver personally this tablet, which now is called the Tablet of the Hague. And I will come to that as well in a few minutes. So for these reasons, 2020 is a very special year. And in fact, as I will explain later, it also happens to be the 75th anniversary of the United Nations Charter, which was the founding document of the United Nations. And there are commemorations taking place as we speak in coming days and throughout much of the year. The concept of the need to establish peace is not something that sort of happened, with the creation of the League of Nations. Although that was a very important step because it brought together many nations to sign a treaty that would lay the basis, an institutional basis for peace and security. In fact, the whole question of peace and the need to establish peace, the need to set aside warfare and violence and weapons as a way of resolving differences between states goes back centuries, goes back many, many years. In fact, Dante, the very famous Italian poet, wrote a piece in the year 1311. In other words, hundreds of years before the creation of the League of Nations, in which he said the following. He said, "It is evident that mankind too is most free and easy to carry on its work when it enjoys the tranquility of peace." You have to think a little bit about the time in which he wrote this. Europe in the 14th century did not really have sovereign states. There was nothing called Germany or France or Italy. What you had was basically a few smaller kingdoms, principalities that were ruled by a local lord. And there was constant battles and wars and alliances. And Dante lamented that this created a context for instability, for killing, for warfare. And he basically said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a period of peace and tranquility? And then to conclude the quote, he said, to achieve this state of universal well-being, a single world government is necessary. Now, isn't that fascinating that in the 14th century, an Italian poet was already thinking of some kind of sort of global government. I guess he was probably thinking in terms of Europe. America hadn't yet been discovered. So his vision of the world was essentially the European sort of region. But he said, you know, in order to have this peace and tranquility, we should have a government for the whole of Europe. Several centuries later, there was a French clergyman, a Catholic priest. His name was Charles Castel de Saint-Pierre. He lived between the 17th and the 18th century, from 1658 to about 1743. And he was a very fascinating character. You know, although he was a member of the priesthood, he was an intellectual. He was a very sought after speaker. And in the French salons, the aristocrats would invite this Catholic priest to come and give talks, the equivalent of a fireside today, because he was so intelligent and educated and enlightened. And he basically was making exactly the same case that Dante had made 3 centuries before. You know, we need to create a context for peace and security in Europe, because warfare, because violence, because constant conflict is a huge distraction. It uses our resources, it kills our people, it makes for widows and orphans, and it's just a very inefficient way of governing the world. And when Saint-Pierre died, there was this French philosopher, Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that basically inherited all the papers of Saint-Pierre, the Catholic priest. And he began to go through them, and he realized just how thoughtful and how courageous and how farsighted were the proposals that Saint-Pierre had put forward for creating what he called a European federation. And so Rousseau took over these papers, and he espoused the cause of creating a federated state in Europe. And this is yet again a very interesting historical example of how the concept of peace and security is actually an ancient one. It goes back many, many centuries. Of course, in the United States, we have our own experience with the founding fathers. You know, Alexander Hamilton said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. He said that people must be brought under the mild and salutary coercion of the law if they are to avoid the destructive coercion of the sword. It's a very poetic, very elegant way of saying, you know, we need to create a state in which people will abide by the rule of law, because if we don't have that, then the alternative is warfare and violence. You know, the destructive coercion of the sword is the way he put it. And Hamilton, together with a few others, you know, were the ones who eventually created the United States of America, a new form of government that gave to the federal government the monopoly on the use of force and the monopoly on a number of other attributes like printing money and regulating trade between the states and so on, which was very imaginative, very innovative. It was difficult to do because there was a lot of opposition on the part of the states who felt that this federal government would become like a big brother. It would overwhelm, and it would be abusive, and the states would essentially not be protected from a much bigger power. And yet it didn't happen. It didn't happen because it had a strong legal underpinning, because embedded in the US Constitution, there was the concept of the rule of law and a division of jurisdiction and power between the states, the local governments, and of course the federal government. So the federal government would have the monopoly on the use of force. The states would no longer have their own armies and declare war to each other. The federal government would print the money. There wouldn't be different kinds of money floating around in the United States, each state issuing its own debt, issuing its own bonds, and so on and so forth. And historians have come to understand that this very important moment in US history, the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia and the adoption of the Constitution, was in fact what led eventually to the emergence of the United States as a global economic and political power, because it established peace between the states. And sure, in the 19th century we had the Civil War, but that was a different conflict. It was very much focused on slavery and other economic issues. But other than that, once you had established a framework, a legal framework, that said, no, the states are not going to be free to make war on each other. And they are going to now be focusing on the economy, on expansion, on building railroads and building, opening up new territories and so on. You created an engine of economic growth and prosperity that within 100 years had turned the United States into a global economic power. And so that was a particularly important experiment, and a very successful one at that, it seems to me, given what happened later on. Benjamin Franklin was the first US ambassador to France, to the French court. He lived in Paris for something like 10 years, and he was very popular in the French court because Franklin was intelligent, he was charismatic, he had a good sense of humor. He was very popular for the French ladies in the court. And when he came back to the United States and he saw what was happening and how the United States was, in some sense, getting its act together and prospering and growing and acquiring new territories and expanding and so on, he wrote to one of his friends back in Paris, and he told him, if the Constitution succeeds, I do not see why you, meaning in Europe, might not form a federal union and one grand republic in all of its different states and kingdoms by means of a convention like the one we had in Philadelphia some years ago. So Franklin was already arguing, hey, you Europeans, you should do what we have done here. It would actually be very beneficial to you. For me, this letter from Franklin to the French diplomat, a friend of his, tells you a little bit about how far-sighted he was and how he was advising the Europeans to do what the Americans had the courage to do in the late 18th century. Now, one final example is a German philosopher by the name of Kant. Kant lived, again, 18th century. He was born in 1724 and died in 1804. And Kant is perhaps one of the most interesting, most insightful, wisest of all philosophers. And you know what he said, and you know what he said is amazing to me because he said it in the 18th century. He said that the most difficult problem, the last problem to be solved by the human race, is going to be the problem of international order. He said, men have formed states to constrain their passions, but each state seeks to preserve its absolute freedom, even at the cost of a lawless state of savagery. And then he laments, you know, again, like Dante before him, like Saint-Pierre, like Rousseau, he laments the waste of life, the waste of energy, the weapons, the warfare, the violence, all these distractions which basically retard human and social progress. And he says that the time will come when humanity will either face the peace of a vast graveyard or peace by reason design. He said that that would be the choice which humanity would eventually have to contemplate. Either we're going to have peace, but it'll be the peace of the graveyard. That means we're all going to be dead, right? Or he said the alternative is to have peace by reasoned design. In other words, a peace that is a structure that is established on the basis of law and order. And in arguing, obviously, for a piece of reasoned design, not the piece of the eternal graveyard, he said that we should form a voluntary federation of nations within a framework of respect for agreed rules. And he said that if you did this, eventually this would turn into a perfect civil union of mankind. My friends, you know, he's talking about the unity of mankind, you know, in the late 18th century. Kant was insightful, he was farsighted, and he anticipated what would be the choice that we would face in due course. And for me, it is a great source of regret that it took humanity a couple of hundred years after Kant, you know, for us to finally realize that these were indeed the choices that we were facing: the graveyard or peace by reason design. Unfortunately, World War I was an example of the choice that we made in favor of the graveyard. World War I involved 17 million fatalities. It was up to that point the most intense, the most destructive, the most global conflict that we have ever had. And, you know, Wilson, who was then president of the United States, he was greatly anguished by the war. In the early phases of the war, he did not wish the United States to be part of it. You know, he saw it as something between the Europeans, let them sort it out. But then little by little, he realized that there would have to be US participation and involvement, that Europe in and of itself would not be able to establish peace. And so with great reluctance, the United States entered into the war. But as soon as this happened, Wilson immediately set about creating or designing what Kant would have referred to as peace by reason design. In other words, a framework, a structure, an organization to which nations would join and they would sign undertakings and agreements, you know, that would commit them to peace and security. And, you know, when I read some of the things that Wilson said at that time, the speeches that he gave, because he was a great advocate of the League of Nations. He wanted the United States to join and to be a central part of that initiative. But he also understood that he needed to get approval of the U.S. Senate for the charter of the League of Nations. It was called a covenant. Interesting from a Baha'i perspective, the terminology, a covenant. So he was traveling all over the United States, giving speeches here, giving speeches there, giving speeches to the senators, you know, arguing that we need to do this. This is an important initiative. It is peace by reason design, which we need against the background of 17 million dead in World War I. And let me just share with you something that he said in a speech in 1919. He said, "My clients are the children. My clients are the next generation. They do not know what promises and bonds I undertook when I ordered the armies of the United States to the soil of France. But I know, and I stand to redeem my pledges to the children. They shall not be sent upon a similar errand." See, for Wilson, sending young men, he calls them children because some of them were 18, 19, 20, you know, young men. for Wilson to send them to Europe and for many of them to die in Europe was a source of great anguish. And he said, I don't want future presidents to ever have to confront this choice, to ever have to do what I have been forced to do by circumstances. And the motivation for him for creating the League of Nations was indeed preventing a similar conflict in the future. I'm a great admirer of Wilson. He had very good intentions, and Shoghi Effendi also has recognized that although the League failed, Shoghi Effendi says that it was a very important step in the recognition of the importance of working together, collaborating, and establishing some kind of treaty that would commit nations to respect peace and to do things in peaceful ways. The covenant of the League was a very innovative document, and it embedded in it many of the ideas which you find in the Baha'i writings about collective security. It provided for disarmament in Article 8. It provided for the peaceful settlement of disputes and arbitration and conciliation. Wilson he's a very practically minded gentleman. And he said that if nations had the opportunity before going to war of debating, discussing, consulting, what are the issues that are leading us, to war and to violence against each other, he said that 99% of the time, as a result of that process of consultation and discussion, they would lay arms aside and the conflict would be avoided altogether. In one of his speeches, he tells the anecdote of two friends of his who, whenever they were angry with each other, they had agreed that rather than go into violent physical attacks and punches, what they would do is they would actually go out of town to the margins of the city, and then they would try to work it out there. And he said that 99% of the time, by the time they got to the margins of the city, they realized how silly they were, and they did not fight, and they sort of made up. And so in the covenant, Wilson introduced something that we would call today a cooling off period. In other words, before declaring hostilities and going to war, the nations were actually obliged to have a cooling off period that could last as long as 9 months. And during that period, they would talk. They would meet under the auspices of the League. They would analyze what are the issues that we have? Why is it that we're on the verge of warfare? And it was only after this cooling off period had expired, and only if the issues had not been resolved, that then nations would be free to declare war on each other, right? And so the League had all of these very interesting ideas, including the concept of collective security, which is of course something that was very much embedded in Baha'u'llah's vision of global order. The definition of collective security, which Baha'u'llah gives in one of his tablets, is exactly the definition that is used today when we talk about collective security. Now, at about the time that Wilson was traveling around the United States, trying to get support for the League, he was basically doing lobbying. He was traveling all over the United States because he wanted the population to be in favor of the League, and he wanted the population to tell their senators to vote to approve the League. Unfortunately, the United States Constitution establishes a very high threshold for approving international treaties. You need a 2/3 majority. So it's the equivalent of impeachment, If you want to have a treaty approved, if you have 100 senators, you need 67 votes to approve an international treaty. So it's a very high bar. And that's what ultimately defeated Wilson, that he could only get 60 votes out of the 67 that he needed at that time. or 66 out of 98, I can't remember. I think at that time, the United States was not 50 states, I think it was 48 or 49, but it was, 2/3. Well, Abdul-Baha had been following, of course, World War I very closely. He and the people in Palestine, what today is Israel, had been affected by it. There was hunger, there were shortages of food. The war was global in scope, and that part of the world was not unaffected by it. And of course, Abdul-Baha was keenly aware of the destruction, the killing, the widows and the orphans. One of my favorite ever speeches of Abdul-Baha, which I would really urge you to read if you can. It's available on the internet. Just type in Google Abdul-Baha at Stanford University, 1912, and you will come to the text of the speech that he gave there. In other words, 7 years before, when he was traveling in America, he spoke to a group of 2,000 students, administrators, and faculty at Stanford. He was hosted by the president of the university, Dr. David Starr, who was a very well-known, very respected scientist. And Hassan Balyuzi, who wrote the biography of Abdul-Baha, says that this was one of the most weighty speeches that Abdul-Baha gave while he was in America. And when you read that speech, you are moved because Abdul-Baha knows what is coming to Europe within 2 years. World War I began in 1914. He knows exactly. And he laments in the speech, the violence that is coming and that is going to destroy that continent, that is going to kill 17 million people. So Abdul-Baha was greatly aware of the heavy costs that we pay as a result of not having peace by reason design, as a result of the fact that we go to war for the the most trivial justifications. And so in 1919, he wrote to an organization in The Hague, which is the Netherlands, called the Central Organization for a Durable Peace. This is what we would call today a civil society organization. It was not a government entity. It was a group of mostly men, academics, writers, intellectuals, people who had come together to make the case for the League of Nations. They were believers in establishing a framework for collective security that would bring nations together to sign a treaty and to establish a basis for peace by reason design, to use the term of Kant. And so, as I said before, he sent off this tablet, but it wasn't until 1920, several months later, into the new year, that the tablet was received, and that he actually sent somebody, to deliver the tablet in person. And I'm just going to share some of the main ideas of the tablet. He begins by saying, there is not one soul whose conscience does not testify that in this day there is no more important matter in the world than that of universal peace. Of course, this is 1919. World War I is about to come to an end, and 17 million people, many of them young people in the height of their youth, have died in the killing fields. And he says that the efforts for peace must be supplemented by other measures that go beyond the issues of conflict and security. He says that other principles must underpin the search for peace. And in particular, he touches upon the role of religion. He says that religion must be the cause of fellowship and love. If it becomes the cause of estrangement, separation, then it is not needed, for religion is like a remedy. If it aggravates the disease and it becomes unnecessary, This is exactly what he told the students and the professors at Stanford University, say 7 years before. This idea that if religion doesn't bring people together, it's better to be without it. In Stanford, he said it would be better to live under irreligious conditions because religion is, if the remedy makes the patient sicker, then you throw away the remedy. Right? And so for him, religion had to play a very important role in changing people's values and changing people's attitudes, you know, so that they would actually wish to have peace and they would refuse violence and warfare because they would see each other as members of one human family. He said that properly understood, this is very important, not just any old understanding of religion. No, he's saying when you understand religion properly in its true sense, religion trains man, educates morals, compels the adoption of virtues, and is the all-inclusive power which guarantees the felicity of the world of mankind. So he's arguing for a vital role for religion in the establishment of peace, but he is warning and he's saying it has to be religion properly understood as a source of unity, as a source of fellowship, bringing people together, not a fanatical set of ideals that basically separate people together in different groups. In the Tablet of the Hague, Abdu'l-Baha condemns nationalisms in very strong terms. He says that God has set up no frontier between France and Germany. If this conception of patriotism remains, it will be the primary cause of the world's destruction. Very powerful words, very powerful words. And of course, you know, what is it that led to World War II 20 years later? It was nationalism. It was this conception that God has created borders between France and Germany and other countries. But in 1919, in the Tablet of the Hague, Abdu'l-Baha is saying, no, these borders are imaginary. They don't exist. They are figments of our imagination. They are walls that we have built. In Stanford, he said, we send our young people into the battlefield to defend these borders, which in fact have no reality. They don't exist. In the sight of God, there is no difference between a Frenchman and a German. And yet we shed blood and we send our children into the killing fields to defend these narrow concepts of nationality. Abdu'l-Baha seems to have been very well versed on the various kinds of weapon systems that existed at that time. And in the Tablet of the Hague, he mentioned several of them. This kind of rifle, this kind of cannon, you know, this kind of weaponry, by name, the Mauser rifle and this and that and so on. He's obviously studied them and is familiar with their destructive power. But then he condemns them, and he says that these are the malignant fruits of material civilization. You know, it's very harsh language if you think of it. You know, he is very dismissive of these weapons of destruction because he says that ultimately they have been built to cause suffering, to kill other people, you know, to turn us into animals. He says that if religion had been properly understood, and if we had been more inclined to the divine, because we understood religion to be a force for fellowship and for unity, these fiery weapons would never have been invented. And human energy would have been wholly devoted to useful inventions and praiseworthy discoveries. Again, very powerful words. He's saying, in a way, this is echoing what Baha'u'llah had said to Edward Brown in 1890. Baha'u'llah, when he met with this Cambridge professor, an Orientalist, you know, he had lamented how kings and rulers were spending their resources building weapons of destruction rather than in that which would be conducive to the happiness of mankind, he said. And so Abdul Baha, many years later in the Tablet of the Hague, picks up the same theme. And he says that if we had understood religion properly, human energy would have been wholly devoted to useful inventions and praiseworthy discoveries. And then he goes on to talk about the importance of education to immunize humanity against the destructive forces of ignorance. So it's a very, very powerful document, my friends, and I think that 2020 is a very appropriate year to go back to it, to study it, and to remember it, because I think it is a document for posterity. It is something that our children and our grandchildren will read and will study and will come to admire Abdul Baha's insight into this very serious problem of warfare. And then towards the end of the tablet, he makes one recommendation, and I want to highlight this because it is being discussed today very actively, exactly Abdul Baha's idea, of course with a different terminology, but I will explain. In the letter, in the Hague, in a tablet, he calls for the establishment of a supreme tribunal, And he describes what the Supreme Tribunal is going to be. It's going to be, he says, made up of members of the world's parliaments, to be at the basis of a new global order based on the rule of law. In other words, he was looking around and he was saying that, governments were experimenting with various forms of democracy in many parts of the world. The United States already had a US Congress. Parliaments in European nations had existed already for a long time. In some cases, like the United Kingdom, for hundreds of years. So many of these countries were emerging as parliamentary democracies. And so what he said is that these parliaments should select a few members, and then these members from the parliaments of all the nations of the world should gather together in this Supreme Tribunal. And then this Supreme Tribunal should be given the authority, to essentially do international law, focused specifically on the issue of peace. And this year in 2020, being the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, this subject is being discussed very actively. The term that is now used is not a Supreme Tribunal; it is called a World Parliamentary Assembly, And in the global governance book that I have written with Arthur Dahl and Maya Groth, that was published earlier this year, and that will be launched in a big event next week. And I have asked Nasser to send you an invitation because it promises to be a very good event. It will have many very prominent speakers, including one of the Under-Secretary Generals of the United Nations. In the book, we actually have an entire chapter where we develop the idea of a World Parliamentary Assembly, how it would be chosen, how it would be formed, who would be the members. And this is something that actually can be done without amending the UN Charter. It's something that the United Nations, as it exists today, has the authority to create. And this issue is being debated in multiple fora, and I have myself been promoting this idea in many of the talks and presentations which I have made in recent months in the context of this UN commemorations. Let me finish just sharing with you some additional thoughts. Our present order, as we have it, is not on a sustainable path. Shoghi Effendi said the world, to whichever continent we turn our gaze, to however remote a region our survey may extend, is everywhere assailed by forces it can neither explain nor control. That assessment, which he made in 1931, remains completely valid today. And In that year as well, he said the fundamental cause of the world's unrest is our failure to adjust our system of economic and political institutions to the imperative needs of a rapidly evolving age. And again, more than 100 years, well, 90 years after he made this statement, it remains absolutely valid and true. And of course, we have made progress in some areas. The last 100 years have not been a total waste. We have made progress in improving a number of social and economic indicators. Life expectancy is longer, infant mortality is lower. We have reduced extreme poverty in a big way in the last few decades. We have made great strides in science and technology. And so, in assessing the present, we need to be aware that it hasn't all been a waste, that we have achieved a great many things. But this progress has been very uneven and very chaotic. It has left many people behind. Its fruits have been very unevenly distributed. And in some areas, such as our global politics and sort of the essential nature of our world order, we're pretty much where we were in 1931 when Shoghi Effendi wrote those statements. Except that today the United Nations has 193 sovereign nations, each one pursuing its own national interest in a very uncoordinated way. There is no meaningful international cooperation to address global problems. And as a result of these, we have these unresolved crises. Climate change is started to kick in a big way. Today, there was a very fascinating report, which was widely commented in the media, about a report by I think it is the Worldwide Life Fund. It's some important environmental organization that every 2 years writes a report specifically referring to the state of nature, where we are in terms of biodiversity, in terms of sort of the coexistence between us humans, Homo sapiens, and members of the animal kingdom. And in this year's report, they link the current virus, COVID-19, in a very direct way to what is happening on the environment. Essentially, we human beings, because we're multiplying very quickly, because we're adding to population by hundreds of millions of people every year, we are essentially pushing out animal habitats. We are building more highways. We are building more housing for the people that need the housing. We are essentially entering animal habitats and displacing these creatures, to farther and farther places. And as a result of that, there has been a huge depletion in the number of animal species. And furthermore, as we enter into these habitats, we're coming into contact with animals that have viruses against which we don't have immunity, such as bats and other animals, other creatures. And so this invasion into areas that were traditionally sanctuaries for animals and for nature is coming back to haunt us. It is having an impact on us and is bringing about Ebola, SARS, MERS, and now the coronavirus. And so we have these very, very huge unresolved problems. And although we have made progress, as I said before, we still have close to 800 million people who can't read and write, are illiterate. We have 820 million people who are malnourished, which is a very sad commentary on the current state of the world. And of course, we have something like 750 million people who are extremely poor, except that that number is rising this year because of the economic calamity that we are living through. And of course, we also have 9,000 nuclear weapons which of course have the capacity to destroy and obliterate material civilizations. Right? So we are going through a very difficult period in human history. And for me, the Tablet of the Hague is a very important reminder that we're not lacking in solutions. The problem that we face today is not that we don't have proposals, not that we don't have ideas, not that we don't know what to do. Even on the climate change side, the scientists know exactly what needs to be done to address climate change. What is missing is not the knowledge, what is missing is the political will. I used to work many years ago for the International Monetary Fund. It's one of these global organizations originally created in a UN conference together with the World Bank in 1944. And the IMF came up with a report late last year that basically said that a carbon tax is the most effective instrument to mitigate climate change. Climate change has come about because we have been subsidizing energy, because we don't pay the true cost of energy. They argue if we were to price energy at the right level, we would not only provide disincentives for energy consumption, which is the root cause of climate change, but also we would generate revenue, which would then allocate, to deal with those malnourished, 820 million malnourished people, to improving our systems of education, to improving our infrastructure, to doing all kinds of other things which today are not done because we don't have the resources. So again, I emphasize, it is not an issue of not knowing what to do. It is an issue of lack of political will, failures of leadership in the world. But the Tablet of the Hague, for me, is a reminder that the solutions are out there. We as individuals have a special responsibility, to work with others, other people in other civil society organizations, to pressure our governments to begin to take actions, so that we begin to confront some of these challenges, which pose a serious threat to our future. Thank you very much, my friends. I have spoken for long enough, and perhaps there is an opportunity for a few questions.
Dr. Lopez, thank you so much, always sharing such incredible gifts of wisdom and experience with us. And as challenging as the world is right now, that you offer us hope because there are solutions that have been given to us. So thank you. So dear friends, bless you all for your self-discipline and patience in not putting your questions and comments in the chat box. We now open up the chat box for questions related to Dr. Lopez's talk, or you will get the evil eye from Dr. B.
God, no.
Just kidding, Dr. B.
While they are putting their questions, we are really privileged to have Dr. Lopez and his willingness to share his thoughts with us so regularly. And I really appreciate that from the bottom of my heart, really. And thank you very much. And thank also Mrs. Lopez to let you also to spend your time with us, really. Please give her our love, really, very much.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, Nasir, and with your dear friends.
Blessings to you. So you've answered all of the world's problems, Dr. Lopez. There's no questions, nor are there comments. This is unlike you. Not you, Dr. Lopez. Okay, friends. Oh, maybe they're writing dissertations. Okay, Gary Fleming, thank you so much for a very interesting and thoughtful presentation. It is always a pleasure to listen to you. That was from our speaker last week.
All right, friends. Thank you so much. And please have a very nice weekend. And look up that invitation which Nasir kindly sent to you. The event is next Friday. It begins at noontime. It will last about an hour and 20 minutes. And it is going to be very much focused on the book. It's like an official presentation of the book. But it should be a very stimulating discussion because it will have very important people commenting and presenting their ideas. It will have, as I said, an Undersecretary General of the United Nations. The moderator will be an ambassador from New Zealand. Amanda Ellis, a very, very highly regarded diplomat. It will have a federal judge by the name of Mark Wall, who is one of the world's leading authorities on corruption, who has called for the creation of an international anti-corruption court. And then there will be other people, you know, important academics and you know, very prominent personalities. So it should be a fun, sort of stimulating discussion. And you, especially the Baha'is in the audience tonight, will feel very reassured to see the extent to which the vision of world order put forward by Shoghi Effendi in his letters in the 1930s and 1940s is gradually taking shape in the world out there, and is being presented by people who, in many cases, are not aware of Shoghi Effendi, who know nothing about Abdul Baha, and yet, you know, have diagnosed the world's conditions, and are coming forward with proposals that are very much a powerful echo of the vision of world order presented in the Baha'i writings.
Wonderful. Dr. Lopez, if you have energy, there's a gratitude and a question. Is that okay? Can you stay with us a little bit longer? So Ray said, thank you, fantastic. And Bill G, as an economist, would you say a few words about the cost of COVID-19, particularly in the light of government debt?
Yes, I'm happy to comment a little bit on that. You know that, unfortunately, for many, many years, not just in the United States, but in many parts of the world, we have been running up debts year after year after year. You know, somehow governments don't seem to be able to live within their means, and so every year there is a deficit which needs to be financed by issuing debt, and the debt piles up year after year after year. Right? The United States is not an exception; it's a very typical case. What happened in the financial crisis 10 years ago is that to bail out the banks and to basically stimulate the economy and to provide for unemployment compensation to those who lost their jobs and so on, governments went on a huge spending spree. And they did that partly to prevent the crisis from turning into a Great Depression, you know. And most economists, and I would count myself among them, would say that many of those interventions were justified, even though they involved accumulating more debt. So just when we thought that we were beginning to turn the corner, then COVID-19 comes this year. And then guess what? Governments again have to spend huge amounts of money to, this time not to bail out the banks, but to bail out the population, because COVID imposes a lockdown, and then people lose their jobs, they can't work, restaurants close, airlines have to shut down their flights, and everybody is hurting because the economy basically comes to a screeching halt. And so the government steps in to stimulate, to help, to assist, to support, to subsidize, and so on. And that again is justified. Most economists will say the government cannot stand idle by. It cannot simply say, oh, well, you know, we don't have the money. So they borrow from the future to spend the money in the present. Right? And so here we are in 2020, not just in the United States, but in many other countries of the world, with debt levels that were last seen at the end of World War II, 1945, 46, 47. In the United States, you go back to 1947, and debt levels were roughly what they are today, right? But that was because there was a war. And after the war, the United States grew very quickly, very rapidly over the next several years. The demographics were very favorable. There were a lot of people joining the labor force. And so those deficits came down and the debt came down very rapidly. But today the situation is trickier. It's trickier, and our room for maneuver is much more limited. And so it is a source of concern. It is a source of concern. The thinking is that once this crisis is over, hopefully governments will go back to more restrained policies, more responsible policies. They will not just keep borrowing from the future and passing these huge debts to our children and our grandchildren. And some countries have done that successfully. Not every country in the world is highly indebted. There are some countries that have managed their public finances very responsibly, very cautiously, even in the middle of this crisis. So it is a potential source of vulnerability to the global economy. Absolutely, there is no question about it. Something needs to be done. Maybe not now, but once we have a vaccine, once people go back to work, once the economy recovers, governments have to set the public finances on a more sustainable path. Otherwise, if we don't do that, if we don't use the recovery as an opportunity to bring those debts down, then we basically just have entered into a kind of a vicious circle, right? Where we need to keep spending and borrowing from the future to stimulate the economy now, and that's not sustainable. Eventually, that collapses. It's not sustainable. You cannot do that forever. There was a famous economist, I can't remember his name, but he was the head of the Federal Reserve Bank. And it was something that he said that strikes you as being very obvious, right? But it is true, obvious but true. He said, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop, right? You might say, well, yeah, that is obvious, right? If something cannot go on forever, it will at some point stop, all right? And it is clear that you cannot pile debts forever, At some point, what happens when you have huge levels of debt is that more and more of your annual expenditure has to go to pay interest on the debt, which means that you have less and less money for vital things like, your infrastructure and education and social security and pension payments. Eventually, you run up against these constraints. The principles that we use to manage our family finances are the same principles that apply at the level of the nation as well, to a great extent. We don't pile up credit card debt forever because we know that that's not sustainable. At some point, we have to stop eating to pay our credit card debt, and that's not sustainable. And so we're not there yet in terms of the finances of our nation, but we're getting there little by little. And so I very much hope that in 2021, once this crisis has hopefully gone, and once we are vaccinating people and people are getting back to work, that we will then return to more responsible fiscal policies. And one element of that may have to be raising taxes, perhaps raising taxes on the rich especially, which we haven't done.
Thank you for your thoughtful response. So now you've stimulated more questions, and hopefully you have the energy to answer these last three questions.
Okay.
All right, so from Dr. Abbas, what happens when debt is higher than revenue? I think you addressed it a little bit, but would you like to elaborate?
Yeah, I think I have addressed that.
Okay. And then from Pat, didn't the government invest in old industries rather than giving money to people to let the people create the post-COVID economy?
Yeah. That is actually one of my previous lectures. I spoke about some of the elements of a post-COVID economy. I'm actually moderating an event on September 16, which will very much focus on this issue. Not the one I mentioned before of September 18, which Nasser sent you the invitation, but there's another event also in the context of commemorations of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And this event, which is next Wednesday, is actually called post-COVID and the emergence of a new framework for economic and social governance. In other words, what kind of an economy do we want to have after COVID-19? What kind of changes do we want to introduce in the way that we do economic policy to take account of the vulnerabilities that this crisis has shown? And that event actually will have very interesting panelists. The former president of Costa Rica, a lady by the name of Laura Chinchilla, and a couple of 2 or 3 other very noted thinkers will be joining me to discuss exactly this issue. It's a large subject, but it involves, maybe we need to spend more on health and strengthening our public health systems, because this COVID-19 has shown that our public health infrastructures are very vulnerable, very weak, in some cases very run down. Maybe not so much in the United States, although as you remember, in March and April, we had some very serious problems, coping with the cases. Our hospitals were filled to capacity. We didn't have enough ventilators and so on. But in other countries, it's been a calamity. It's complete calamity. I mean, what is happening in Brazil, what is happening in India, in other parts of the developing world really shows to what extent the governments have been caught completely unprepared for this kind of calamity, right? So we have weapons, we have aircraft that can bomb cities. That's where our money has gone, right? And yet we don't have enough beds in hospitals to treat people and to protect them from dying prematurely, right? To me, that's a failure. It's a failure of governance. And I think that moving forward, we need to rethink how we're going to be spending the money that we collected in our budgets. Governments tax people, tax businesses, they collect revenue and then they spend that revenue. Well, looking back, it's obvious that we are not spending that money wisely. It's like, managing your household finances, right? How you spend your money, especially if you're a family, if you have children, requires wisdom, requires caution. You need to set your priorities correctly. You don't want to sacrifice your children's education so that you will be able to buy a flashy sports car when a family car could do just as well and not be so expensive, and you have more money for your children's education and you invest in their future, right? I mean, that's an obvious point to make, but just as we at the level of the family make those decisions and make those choices, and those choices have implications for the welfare of our family in the future, it's exactly the same at the level of governments. And to me, this crisis has shown that most governments everywhere are not spending the tax revenue wisely. A lot of it's being wasted in silly projects, subsidizing energy, giving tax breaks to the rich, which they don't need, instead of taxing them more justly and fairly. This American billionaire, Warren Buffett, a couple of years ago, he was complaining that the tax rates paid by his secretary are higher than the tax rates that he pays as a multi-billionaire. And he was saying, I like to pay more taxes. I like the tax system to change so that I pay my fair share. And I don't find myself in this situation of paying at a lower rate than my secretary, who obviously, is a person of limited means, and so on and on and on, right? The kind of money that we're spending on so-called national security. Perhaps we need to redefine national security. We define national security today in essentially militaristic terms, right? Our ability to kill other people and to cause destruction, with our machinery. Well, maybe the time has come to think of national security in terms of human well-being. Maybe national security should be understood to mean, hey, let's have a health system that when something like a pandemic comes, nobody dies unnecessarily, so that we don't have 200,000 people dead in the United States, one of the wealthiest nations in the world, right? Maybe we need to rethink the meaning of national security, right? Let me ask you, You know, don't you think that you would feel safer if you knew that there is scientific research underway, you know, to protect us from the next pandemic, that governments are spending and funneling resources to research, to universities, to the National Institutes of Health, and to create a research infrastructure that will better prepare us to deal with the next pandemic, right? Don't you think that that is a better definition of national security than to be told that your country has added another 1,000 nuclear weapons so that it can wipe out humanity and the rest of the world, you know, 3 times over, right? So, you know, these are some of the questions which I think we're going to have to rethink in the context of a post-COVID economy in the future.
Dr. Lopez, they have already asked that if you send me the information about Wednesday meeting, then I will forward that and remind them also about the Friday meeting too.
Okay, all right. I will do that.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think we should close it, Dara. If you don't mind, Rebecca will say the closing prayer. And as I said before, I can't thank you enough, Dr. Lopez. Truly, I enjoyed very, very much. I'm sure everybody did. Rebecca, are you here?
Yes, this is a prayer by Baha'u'llah for tests and difficulties. O thou whose tests are a healing medicine to such as are nigh unto thee, whose sword is the ardent desire of all them that love thee, whose dart is the dearest wish of those hearts that yearn after thee, whose decree is the sole hope of them that have recognized thy truth. I implore thee by thy divine sweetness and by the splendors of the glory of thy face, to send down upon us from thy retreats on high that which will enable us to draw nigh unto thee. Set then our feet firm, O my God, in thy cause, and enlighten our hearts with the effulgence of thy knowledge, and illumine our breasts with the brightness of thy names. Wow.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Dara, could you please open the...
Oh, thank you, friends. What a beautiful evening. And unmute yourselves.
Thank you,
It's
Dr. Lopez.
tea and dessert and community time.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Lopez, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Wonderful
Lopez.
fire. Thank you, Dr. Lopez. Thank you, Dr. Nasser.
Wonderful as usual.
Are we going to receive email for this
Yes,
event?
you are going to get the email.